They said she was too small for the job. At barely 5 feet tall and weighing maybe 110 pounds soaking wet, the other recruits snickered behind her back during training. The drill instructors rolled their eyes when she struggled with the heavy equipment. Even her own squad leader questioned whether she belonged in a combat zone. But when the mortar rounds started falling and 5 of her teammates lay bleeding in the kill zone, she became something none of them expected. She became their lifeline home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The forward operating base Mackenzie sat like a concrete island in the middle of Afghanistan's Helmand province, surrounded by endless stretches of tan dirt and scattered rocks that seemed to absorb the sun's heat and radiate it back in shimmering waves. The base had been carved out of nothing, built by engineers who understood that survival meant creating order from chaos, safety from vulnerability. Guard towers rose from each corner like weathered sentinels, their machine gun nests manned by soldiers who'd learned to scan horizons with the kind of focused intensity that came from knowing that complacency killed. Inside the medical tent, the air carried the sharp bite of disinfectant mixed with the metallic scent of sterilized equipment. Canvas walls rippled softly in the morning breeze, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the organized chaos of military medicine. Supply crates lined the walls, each one labeled with the kind of precise military nomenclature that left no room for confusion or error. Morphine, bandages, saline solution, surgical instruments, everything needed to keep people alive when the world outside wanted them dead. Specialist Elena Vasquez knelt beside a wooden crate that stood nearly as tall as she did, methodically checking inventory against the clipboard in her small hands. 23 years old, born in San Antonio to parents who'd worked double shifts at the cannery to put food on the table, she'd enlisted the day after high school graduation with dreams of becoming a nurse and serving her country. The Army had made her a combat medic instead, which turned out to be close enough to her original plan that she'd never complained about the assignment. Her BDU uniform hung loose on her slight frame, tailored as much as military regulations allowed, but still managing to make her look like a child playing dress-up in adult clothing. The sleeves were rolled up to accommodate her shorter arms, and her boots, even in the smallest size the Army issued, seemed disproportionately large on her narrow feet. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, secured with enough bobby pins to withstand the kind of physical activity that came with her job. No makeup, no jewelry except for the plain silver cross her grandmother had given her before deployment, and calloused hands that moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to work fast under pressure. She'd been at FOB Mackenzie for 8 months, long enough to know which soldiers complained about minor injuries and which ones waited until they were half dead before seeking medical attention. Long enough to understand that respect in a combat zone was earned through competence under fire, not through physical intimidation or loud declarations of toughness. Long enough to recognize the difference between soldiers who talked about bravery and soldiers who simply acted when action was required. The other medics had accepted her presence with the kind of professional courtesy that military units extended to anyone who could do their job competently. She'd proven herself capable during the routine emergencies that punctuated life on a forward operating base. Heat exhaustion, minor wounds, equipment injuries, the occasional case of food poisoning that swept through the mess hall like wildfire. She'd handled each situation with quiet efficiency, following protocols, maintaining standards, never making mistakes that could cost lives or compromise missions. But acceptance wasn't the same as confidence, and competence in controlled situations didn't automatically translate to trust when the bullets started flying. She'd never been tested under direct enemy fire, never had to make life or death decisions while mortar rounds exploded around her, never had to choose between her own safety and the lives of wounded soldiers who were depending on her to bring them home alive. The infantry soldiers who rotated through the base for resupply and medical clearance treated her with the kind of polite distance that suggested they weren't quite sure what to make of her. She was clearly skilled at her job, obviously dedicated to the mission, but she looked like someone who should be working in a stateside hospital rather than patching up combat casualties in a war zone. Her size made her seem fragile, vulnerable, more like someone who needed protection than someone who could provide it when everything went wrong. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson, a career infantry soldier with 3 deployments and a chest full of ribbons, had been vocal about his concerns during the previous week's briefing. He'd stood in the command tent, all 6 feet 4 inches of him, and addressed the assembled squad leaders with the kind of blunt honesty that came from experience rather than malice. "Look, I'm not questioning her medical training or her dedication to the mission," he'd said, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of someone who'd spent too many years breathing desert dust and cigarette smoke. "But when we're moving through hostile territory and someone goes down, we need medics who can handle the physical demands of battlefield casualty evacuation. We're talking about dragging wounded soldiers through sand, over rocks, sometimes under fire. That's not a job for someone who weighs barely over 100 pounds. The platoon leader, Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, had defended Elena's record and capabilities, pointing out that physical strength wasn't the only factor in effective battlefield medicine. Quick thinking, steady hands, and the ability to remain calm under pressure were equally important, and Elena had demonstrated all of those qualities during her time at the base. But Thompson's concerns weren't entirely without merit, and everyone in the tent knew it. Combat medicine wasn't just about administering first aid in controlled environments. It was about making split-second decisions while explosions shook the ground beneath your feet, about maintaining focus while enemy fire forced you to work in impossible positions, about having the physical capability to move wounded soldiers from danger zones to safe areas where proper medical treatment could be administered. It was about being strong enough to carry someone who might weigh twice as much as you did, fast enough to cover dangerous ground before the enemy could adjust their aim, and tough enough to keep working even when your own body was screaming for rest. The doubts weren't limited to the infantry soldiers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Some of the other medics, particularly the larger men who'd come from backgrounds in construction or manual labor, had expressed similar concerns during private conversations. They'd worked hard to build reputations as soldiers who could handle any situation, who could be counted on to perform under pressure, who wouldn't become liabilities when their units needed them most. Elena's presence raised questions about standards, about whether the military was compromising combat effectiveness in the name of political correctness or demographic diversity. Corporal Jake Williams, a medic from Detroit who'd played football in high school before joining the Army, had made his feelings known during a late-night conversation in the medical tent. He'd spoken quietly, not wanting to be overheard by the wrong people, but his words had carried the weight of genuine concern, mixed with frustration. "It's nothing personal against Elena," he'd said while cleaning equipment after a particularly long day. "She's smart, she knows her stuff, and she works harder than most of the guys in this unit. But smart doesn't stop bullets, and hard work doesn't make you stronger. When someone goes down in a firefight, we need medics who can physically handle the job. That's not about being sexist or discriminatory. That's about keeping people alive." The concerns were understandable, even reasonable. From a certain perspective, combat medicine was inherently physical work, requiring practitioners who could lift, carry, and move under conditions that would challenge even the strongest soldiers. Medical training was crucial, but it was useless if the medic couldn't reach the wounded soldier or couldn't move them to safety once treatment had been administered. The margin for error in combat zones was non-existent, And mistakes could cost lives not just of the wounded, but of the entire unit that might be compromised trying to compensate for a medic's physical limitations. Elena understood the concerns, even if she didn't agree with the conclusions. She'd grown up as the smallest kid in her neighborhood, the shortest student in her class, the lightest player on every sports team she'd ever joined. She'd learned early that size wasn't everything, that determination and intelligence could compensate for physical disadvantages, that underestimation could sometimes be turned into an advantage. She'd also learned that proving yourself was an ongoing process, that respect had to be earned repeatedly, and that some people would never accept that small didn't automatically mean weak. Her training had been thorough, comprehensive, designed to prepare medics for the worst-case scenarios they might encounter in combat zones. She'd learned to treat gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, burns, traumatic amputations, and dozens of other medical emergencies that could occur during military operations. She'd practiced working under simulated combat conditions, with instructors shouting commands and setting off explosions to replicate the chaos and confusion of actual firefights. She'd studied battlefield evacuation procedures, memorized casualty collection protocols, and demonstrated her ability to work quickly and efficiently under pressure. But training scenarios, no matter how realistic, couldn't replicate the physical and psychological demands of actual combat. The adrenaline, the fear, the knowledge that failure meant death for people who were depending on her, the responsibility of making life or death decisions while enemy forces actively tried to kill her and everyone around her. These were things that could only be learned through experience, and Elena's experience was limited to the controlled environment of a forward operating base rather than the chaotic reality of active combat operations. She'd requested assignment to patrol operations, volunteering for missions that would give her the opportunity to prove herself under real combat conditions. But the unit commanders had been reluctant to approve her requests, citing concerns about her physical capabilities and the potential impact on mission effectiveness. They'd kept her on base, handling routine medical duties and providing support for soldiers who rotated through for rest and resupply. Important work, necessary work, but not the kind of work that would silence the doubts about her ability to perform under fire. The frustration was becoming harder to manage. She'd enlisted to serve her country, to use her medical skills to save lives and support the mission, not to spend her deployment treating minor injuries and watching other medics handle the dangerous assignments. She understood the logic behind the commander's decisions, but she also knew that she'd never gain the respect of her fellow soldiers or prove her own capabilities if she was never given the chance to demonstrate them under real combat conditions. The medical tent where she worked had become both her domain and her prison. She knew every piece of equipment, every supply location, every protocol and procedure that governed military medicine. She'd treated hundreds of patients, handled dozens of emergencies, and maintained medical standards that met or exceeded every requirement in the Army manual. But none of that mattered if her fellow soldiers didn't trust her to handle combat situations, if unit commanders didn't believe she could perform under fire, if her own size and appearance undermined confidence in her abilities. The other medics had stopped making direct comments about her size, but the underlying skepticism remained. She could see it in their faces when patrol assignments were discussed, hear it in their voices when they talked about combat operations, feel it in the way they positioned themselves during training exercises. They'd learned to be professionally courteous, but they hadn't learned to trust her with their lives or the lives of their fellow soldiers. The infantry soldiers were less diplomatic. They'd learned to work around her rather than with her, developing backup plans that didn't depend on her presence, making assumptions about her limitations that affected how they approached dangerous situations. They weren't deliberately cruel or overtly discriminatory, but they were practical men who'd learned that survival depended on accurate assessments of capabilities and limitations. In their minds, Elena was a liability waiting to happen, a weak link in a chain that couldn't afford to break. The isolation was subtle but persistent. She ate meals with the other medics, participated in training exercises, contributed to discussions about medical procedures and battlefield protocols. But she was never included in the informal conversations where real trust was built, never invited to join the after-hours gatherings where soldiers shared stories and formed the bonds that would sustain them through combat. She was part of the unit on paper, but not part of the brotherhood that defined military service at its most essential level. Elena had dealt with skepticism and underestimation her entire life, but the stakes had never been this high. In civilian life, proving yourself was about personal satisfaction and career advancement. In a combat zone, proving yourself was about life and death, about the difference between soldiers coming home alive and families receiving folded flags. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, especially when combined with the knowledge that she might never get the chance to prove that she deserved to carry it. She'd written letters to her family, trying to explain the situation without violating operational security or worrying her parents unnecessarily. Her mother had responded with encouragement and pride, reminding her that Vasquez women had always been stronger than they looked, that size was just a number, and that God had given her the skills and determination she needed to succeed. Her father had been more practical, suggesting that she focus on doing her job well and letting her actions speak for themselves rather than trying to convince people who'd already made up their minds. The advice was sound, but it didn't address the fundamental problem. Elena could do her job well, but only if she was given the opportunity to do it. She could let her actions speak for themselves, but only if those actions were witnessed by people who mattered. She could prove herself capable of handling combat situations, but only if she was allowed to enter combat situations in the first place. The base had settled into its evening routine when the call came in. Radio chatter filled the command tent as reports filtered in from Patrol 7, an infantry squad that had been conducting a routine reconnaissance mission in the village of Khalid Bagh, approximately 12 kilometers northeast of the base. The mission had been classified as low risk, a standard presence operation designed to gather intelligence and maintain contact with local civilians who might have information about insurgent activity in the area. Lieutenant Martinez stood over the radio operator, listening to the fragmented reports that painted a picture of what had started as a routine patrol and quickly escalated into something much more dangerous. The squad had been moving through the village when they'd encountered what appeared to be a small group of insurgents, placing an improvised explosive device along the main road. The engagement had been brief but intense, with both sides taking casualties before the insurgents withdrew into the complex terrain that surrounded the village. The initial reports indicated that 5 members of the patrol had been wounded, with at least 2 casualties requiring immediate medical evacuation. The squad leader, Sergeant First Class Robert Chun, had called for helicopter support, but the nearest medical evacuation aircraft was currently committed to another mission and wouldn't be available for at least 90 minutes. The patrol was pinned down by intermittent sniper fire, unable to move the wounded soldiers to a secure landing zone where they could be evacuated by air. Elena stood in the back of the command tent, listening to the radio traffic and understanding the implications of what she was hearing. 5 wounded soldiers trapped in hostile territory with no immediate prospect of evacuation. The base's medical staff would need to deploy forward to provide emergency treatment and coordinate casualty evacuation. This was exactly the kind of situation she'd been training for, the opportunity she'd been waiting for to prove herself under real combat conditions. The base commander, Major David Harrison, turned to address the assembled medical staff. His face was grim, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions that could determine whether soldiers lived or died. Elena had seen that expression before, during briefings about complex operations where success and failure were measured in human lives rather than tactical objectives. We're going to need a medical team to move forward and provide emergency treatment for the wounded, he said, his words measured and precise. The patrol is approximately 45 minutes out by vehicle, assuming we can get through without encountering additional enemy contact. The terrain is rough, the security situation is uncertain, and we don't know the full extent of the casualties or the medical treatment they're going to require. He paused, scanning the faces of the medical personnel who would be responsible for executing whatever plan he approved. Elena stepped forward, her heart racing with anticipation and determination. This was her chance, her opportunity to prove that she belonged in combat operations, that her size didn't define her capabilities, that she could handle the physical and psychological demands of battlefield medicine. "Sir, I volunteer for the mission," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline that was beginning to surge through her system. "I'm ready to deploy immediately, and I have all the medical supplies and equipment needed to provide emergency treatment for multiple casualties." The tent went quiet. Major Harrison looked at her with the kind of measured assessment that commanders used when evaluating soldiers for dangerous assignments. She could see him weighing her medical qualifications against his concerns about her physical capabilities, balancing the tactical requirements of the mission against the human cost of making the wrong decision. Staff Sergeant Thompson stepped forward, his expression respectful but firm. "Sir, with respect, this is going to be a physically demanding mission under hostile conditions. We're talking about potentially carrying wounded soldiers across difficult terrain while under enemy fire. Maybe we should consider sending medics who are better equipped to handle the physical demands of the situation." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke, filling the tent with the tension that came from unspoken but clearly understood implications. Elena felt the familiar surge of frustration and determination that had driven her through every challenge she'd faced in her military career. She'd known this moment would come, had prepared for it, had steeled herself for the skepticism and doubt that would inevitably surface when her capabilities were questioned. "Sir, I understand the concerns about the physical demands of the mission," she said, addressing Major Harrison directly, but speaking loudly enough for everyone in the tent to hear. "But I've been trained for exactly this kind of situation. I know the medical procedures, I have the experience, and I'm prepared to handle whatever challenges we encounter. Those soldiers need medical treatment, and I'm qualified to provide it." The debate continued for several minutes, with various personnel weighing in on the tactical and medical considerations that would influence the mission's success. Elena listened to the discussion, understanding that her future in the unit, her credibility as a combat medic, and her own sense of professional worth all depended on the decision that would be made in the next few minutes. Finally, Major Harrison raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of command and the weight of responsibility that came with making decisions that could cost lives. "Specialist Vasquez, you're going on this mission. Staff Sergeant Thompson, you'll provide security for the medical team. Sergeant Williams, you'll assist with casualty evacuation. We move out in 15 minutes. Elena felt a surge of relief mixed with determination. She'd been given her chance, her opportunity to prove herself under real combat conditions. Now she had to make sure she didn't waste it, that she demonstrated the competence and capability that would justify the commander's confidence in her abilities. The next 15 minutes passed in a blur of preparation and equipment checks. Elena gathered her medical supplies, double-checking her inventory of bandages, medications, and surgical instruments. She strapped on her body armor, adjusted her helmet, and slung her medical bag across her shoulder. The weight of the equipment was substantial, but she'd trained with it enough to know how to distribute the load efficiently and maintain mobility under difficult conditions. The other members of the medical team prepared their own equipment with the kind of focused intensity that came from understanding the stakes involved. This wasn't a training exercise or a routine deployment. This was a combat mission where their skills, judgment, and physical capabilities would be tested under conditions that offered no margin for error. The convoy consisted of 3 armored vehicles, each one carrying medical personnel, security forces, and the supplies needed to treat multiple casualties under field conditions. Elena rode in the lead vehicle, her medical bag secured beside her. Her mind focused on the procedures she might need to perform and the challenges she was likely to encounter. As the convoy rolled through the main gate of Phoebe Mackenzie and into the hostile territory beyond, Elena understood that everything she'd trained for, everything she'd prepared for, was about to be tested in the most demanding way possible. The doubts and skepticism that had followed her throughout her deployment would either be validated or destroyed by her performance over the next few hours. The desert landscape rolled past the convoy's windows, an endless expanse of tan dirt and scattered rocks that seemed to stretch to the horizon in every direction. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. That would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But Elena wasn't admiring the scenery. She was preparing herself mentally for what lay ahead, reviewing medical procedures, considering contingencies, and steeling herself for the moment when her capabilities would be tested under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The radio crackled with updates from the patrol, providing information about the wounded soldiers and the security situation around the village. The reports were fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, but they painted a picture of a complex situation that would require quick thinking, skilled medical treatment, and the physical capability to work under hostile conditions. Elena checked her equipment one final time, ensuring that everything was properly secured and easily accessible. She thought about the wounded soldiers who were waiting for medical treatment, about the families who were depending on her to bring their loved ones home alive, about the unit commanders who had given her this opportunity to prove herself. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but it was also energizing, focusing her mind and sharpening her determination. The convoy was still 20 minutes away from the village when the radio reports indicated that the situation on the 5 of Eschidas ground was deteriorating. The wounded soldiers were losing blood, their conditions worsening with each passing minute. The security situation remained uncertain, with enemy forces maintaining intermittent contact and making it difficult for the patrol to establish a secure perimeter around the casualty site. Elena understood that she was racing against time, that every minute of delay could mean the difference between life and death for the wounded soldiers. She also understood that this was exactly the kind of situation where her size and physical capabilities would be scrutinized, where any limitations would be magnified by the stress and urgency of combat conditions. But she was ready. She'd trained for this moment, prepared for these challenges, and volunteered for this mission because she knew she had the skills and determination needed to succeed. The doubts and skepticism that had followed her throughout her deployment were about to be tested against the reality of her performance under fire. The convoy pressed forward through the darkening desert, carrying Elena toward the moment that would define her career, her reputation, and her own understanding of what she was capable of achieving when everything was on the line. The village of Kalat Bog appeared through the dust-covered windshield like a mirage materializing from the desert heat. Mud brick compounds clustered around a central marketplace, their walls scarred by decades of conflict and weathered by sandstorms that swept across the region with seasonal regularity. Narrow alleyways wound between buildings like arteries through living tissue, creating a maze of potential hiding spots and ambush points that made every approach a calculated risk. Elena pressed her face against the vehicle's armored window, studying the terrain they would need to traverse to reach the wounded patrol. The landscape was unforgiving, a collection of rocky outcroppings, dried irrigation ditches, and scattered debris that would challenge even experienced infantry soldiers moving at full strength. For a medical team carrying wounded casualties, The journey back to the vehicles would be exponentially more difficult. The convoy came to a halt approximately 800 meters from the village center, positioning the vehicles behind a low ridge that provided concealment from potential enemy observers. The sudden silence after hours of engine noise felt ominous, broken only by the metallic ticking of cooling metal and the distant sound of sporadic gunfire that indicated the patrol was still engaged with hostile forces. Staff Sergeant Thompson emerged from the lead vehicle with the fluid motion of a soldier who'd conducted similar operations countless times before. His equipment was arranged with military precision, every piece of gear positioned for maximum accessibility and minimum interference with movement. Elena watched him scan the terrain with practiced eyes, identifying potential routes, possible threats, and tactical considerations that would influence their approach to the casualty site. Elena gathered her medical supplies with methodical efficiency, double-checking each item against her mental inventory. Trauma bandages, hemostatic agents, morphine syrettes, saline solution, airway management tools, everything needed to stabilize critically wounded soldiers under field conditions. The weight of the equipment was substantial, but she'd trained with similar loads until carrying them became second nature. The radio crackled with an update from Sergeant Chun, the patrol leader, whose voice carried the strain of someone coordinating multiple crises simultaneously. Medical team, this is Bravo 7. We have 5 casualties with varying degrees of injury. 2 priority, 3 routine. Enemy contact is intermittent but ongoing. We're located in a compound approximately 400 meters northeast of the marketplace. Be advised, approach routes are exposed to possible sniper fire. Thompson acknowledged the transmission and gathered the team for a quick briefing. Elena positioned herself where she could hear every word, understanding that her survival and the success of the mission depended on her ability to process tactical information and adapt to changing circumstances. The patrol is pinned down in a defensive position, Thompson explained, his voice carrying the calm authority that came from experience rather than rank. We'll move in 2 teams. Williams and Martinez will provide security and establish a perimeter. Vasquez and I will proceed directly to the casualty site and begin medical treatment. Questions? Elena raised her hand. What's the tactical situation regarding enemy strength and positioning? The question was professional, focused on information that would affect her ability to perform medical treatment under hostile conditions. Thompson nodded approvingly. Intelligence suggests we're dealing with a small cell, probably 6 to 8 fighters with small arms, and possibly 1 sniper. They're using hit-and-run tactics, taking shots from concealed positions, and then displacing before we can return effective fire. The good news is they don't appear to have heavy weapons or reinforcements. The bad news is they know the terrain better than we do. The briefing continued for several minutes, covering communication protocols, casualty evacuation procedures, and contingency plans for various scenarios they might encounter. Elena absorbed every detail, understanding that her medical training was only part of what would be required to succeed in this environment. As the team prepared to move out, Elena noticed the way the other soldiers positioned themselves. Williams stayed close enough to provide support, but far enough away to avoid being hindered by her movement. Martinez checked her equipment one final time, her expression suggesting she was still processing doubts about Elena's ability to handle the physical demands of the mission. Thompson maintained his professional demeanor, but Elena could sense his awareness of her every action, his readiness to compensate for any limitations she might display. The approach to the village required careful navigation through terrain that seemed designed to challenge human endurance. Loose rocks shifted under their feet, creating noise that could alert enemy forces to their presence. Dried vegetation crackled with every step, making stealth nearly impossible. The setting sun cast long shadows that provided concealment, but also created blind spots where threats could remain hidden until it was too late to react. Elena moved with deliberate care, placing each step to minimize noise while maintaining the pace necessary to reach the wounded soldiers before their conditions deteriorated beyond the point where field medicine could save them. Her smaller size proved advantageous in navigating narrow passages between rock formations, allowing her to find routes that larger soldiers might have struggled to use effectively. The weight of her medical equipment became more noticeable as they advanced, but she'd trained specifically for this type of movement under load. Her breathing remained controlled, her pace steady, her focus sharp despite the increasing physical demands of the terrain. Behind her, she could hear Williams breathing harder than she was, his larger frame requiring more energy to navigate the same obstacles. The first sounds of the firefight reached them when they were still 300 meters from the patrol's position. The distinctive crack of assault rifles mixed with the deeper boom of grenades, creating a symphony of violence that echoed off the village walls and reverberated through the surrounding countryside. Elena felt her heart rate increase, not from fear, but from the adrenaline response that came with approaching real combat for the first time. Thompson raised his hand, signaling for the team to halt. He pulled out his radio and established contact with Sergeant Chun, coordinating their final approach to avoid being mistaken for enemy forces by soldiers who were already under extreme stress. The conversation was brief but essential, establishing recognition signals and approach routes that would minimize the risk of friendly fire incidents. "Medical team is approaching from the southwest," Thompson transmitted. "We'll be moving through the gap between the two largest compounds. Friendly forces should expect us in approximately 10 minutes. The response came back immediately. "Copy. Medical team. Be advised, sniper activity is concentrated on the eastern approach. We've had multiple near misses from that direction. One of our wounded is hit pretty bad. He's lost a lot of blood and needs attention soon." Elena felt the weight of that information settle in her chest. Someone was dying while she navigated obstacles and coordinated movements. Every minute of delay increased the risk that she would arrive too late to make a difference. But rushing forward recklessly would only create additional casualties and potentially compromise the entire mission. They resumed movement with increased urgency, covering the remaining distance in half the time their initial pace would have required. Elena's breathing became more labored, but her determination remained unwavering. She'd trained for exactly this type of situation, prepared herself mentally and physically for the demands of combat medicine under hostile conditions. The compound where the patrol had taken shelter appeared ahead of them, a collection of mud brick walls and flat roofs that provided defensive positions, but limited options for medical evacuation. Elena could see muzzle flashes from the enemy positions, brief sparks of light that revealed the locations of fighters who were maintaining pressure on the pinned-down patrol. Thompson led them through a gap in the outer wall, moving with the kind of tactical awareness that came from years of combat experience. Elena followed closely, her medical bag secured across her shoulder, her mind already shifting from movement mode to treatment mode. The transition was crucial, requiring her to process the tactical situation while simultaneously preparing to perform medical procedures under conditions that would challenge even experienced emergency room physicians. The interior of the compound was organized chaos. Wounded soldiers lay against the inner walls, their equipment scattered around them in the way that suggested rapid movement under fire. Sergeant Chun moved between positions, coordinating defensive fires while simultaneously trying to manage his casualties. Elena could immediately see that he was dealing with more than he could handle effectively. "Medical's here," Thompson announced as they entered the compound. Chun looked up with visible relief, his face drawn with the strain of command decisions that involved keeping people alive under impossible circumstances. "Thank God," Chun said, gesturing toward the wounded soldiers. "Rodriguez and Park are the priority cases. Rodriguez took shrapnel from an IED, multiple penetrating wounds to the torso and extremities. Park caught a rifle round through the thigh, hit the femoral artery. I've been trying to control the bleeding, but I'm not trained for this level of trauma. Elena immediately shifted into medical mode, her training taking over as she assessed the tactical and medical situation simultaneously. Rodriguez was unconscious, his uniform darkened with blood that had soaked through the improvised bandages that Chin had applied. Park was conscious but pale, his hands pressed against a field dressing that was already saturated with blood from his thigh wound. The other 3 casualties appeared to be in stable condition, suffering from minor shrapnel wounds and concussion effects that would require treatment, but weren't immediately life-threatening. Elena's initial assessment confirmed what Chun had reported. She was dealing with 2 critical patients who needed immediate intervention and 3 stable patients who could wait for treatment until the priorities were stabilized. She knelt beside Rodriguez first, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she conducted a rapid trauma assessment. Multiple penetrating wounds to the chest and abdomen, possible internal bleeding, signs of shock that indicated significant blood loss. The shrapnel had created complex wound patterns that would challenge even experienced trauma surgeons in ideal conditions. In a combat zone, with limited equipment and ongoing enemy contact, the situation bordered on impossible. But impossible wasn't the same as hopeless, and Elena had been trained to work miracles with basic equipment when miracles were what the situation required. She opened her medical bag and began extracting the supplies she would need, her movements. Quick but deliberate, each action based on protocols she'd memorized and practiced until they became automatic responses. "I need someone to maintain security while I work," she called out, not taking her eyes off Rodriguez as she began cutting away his uniform to access the wounds. "And I need someone to help me with patient management." Williams immediately positioned himself where he could watch for enemy activity while remaining close enough to assist with medical procedures. Thompson continued coordinating with Chun, establishing a defensive perimeter that would protect the medical team while they worked. Elena's hands moved across Rodriguez's torso, identifying wound locations and assessing the severity of each injury. The largest piece of shrapnel had penetrated his lower left abdomen, creating a wound that was bleeding internally and externally. 2 smaller fragments had lodged in his right chest, one of which appeared to have punctured his lung based on the way his breathing sounded. She reached for a hemostatic agent, a powder designed to promote rapid blood clotting in traumatic wounds. The application required precision and speed. Too little and the bleeding would continue. Too much and she could create clots that would block circulation to vital organs. Her training had covered the procedures extensively, but this was her first time applying them to a real patient under real combat conditions. The sound of gunfire intensified as she worked, enemy rounds impacting the compound walls with sharp cracks that sent fragments of mud brick showering down on the wounded soldiers. Elena forced herself to ignore the distractions, focusing her attention entirely on the medical procedures that would determine whether Rodriguez lived or died. She applied the hemostatic agent to the abdominal wound, watching as the bleeding slowed, but didn't stop completely. The internal damage was more extensive than she could treat with field equipment, but she could stabilize him enough to survive evacuation to a proper medical facility. Her hands moved to his chest, assessing the lung injury and determining whether she needed to decompress a tension pneumothorax. Rodriguez's breathing was labored but not critical, suggesting that the lung injury was serious but not immediately life-threatening. Elena made the tactical decision to focus on controlling external bleeding before addressing the pulmonary issues, understanding that blood loss was the more immediate threat to his survival. As she worked, she became aware that the other soldiers were watching her with intense interest. This was their first opportunity to see her perform under actual combat conditions, to evaluate whether her medical skills and physical capabilities were adequate for the demands of battlefield medicine. The scrutiny was intense, but Elena had learned to work under observation during her training, and she wasn't going to let it affect her performance now. Rodriguez's wounds required a combination of pressure bandages, hemostatic agents, and careful positioning to minimize blood loss while maintaining his airway and circulation. Elena's hands moved with increasing confidence as her training took over, her muscle memory guiding her through procedures she'd practiced hundreds of times in controlled environments. The bleeding slowed, then stopped as the hemostatic agents took effect, and the pressure bandages compressed the damaged blood vessels. Rodriguez's breathing improved slightly, and his pulse, while still weak and rapid, became more stable. Elena had managed to stabilize his most critical injuries, but he would need surgical intervention within hours to address the internal damage that she couldn't treat in the field. She turned her attention to Park, whose femoral artery wound was continuing to bleed despite the pressure that Chun had been applying. This was a different type of challenge, requiring her to control arterial bleeding while maintaining circulation to the leg below the injury site. Too much pressure and the leg would lose blood supply. Too little pressure and he would bleed to death. Elena positioned herself beside Park, her hands replacing Chun's on the pressure bandage. She could feel the pulse of arterial blood beneath. Her fingers, the rhythmic surge that indicated the femoral artery, had been partially severed by the rifle round. This was exactly the type of injury that had made some soldiers question whether she had the physical strength to handle battlefield medicine. The procedure required sustained pressure applied at precisely the right location, with exactly the right amount of force. Elena's smaller hands actually proved advantageous, allowing her to pinpoint the pressure application more precisely than larger fingers might have managed. She maintained steady compression while simultaneously preparing a more sophisticated bandage system that would control the bleeding without requiring constant manual pressure. Park was conscious and aware, his face pale but his eyes alert. "Doc, am I going to lose the leg?" he asked, his voice steady despite the obvious pain he was experiencing. "Not if I can help it," Elena replied, her tone confident and reassuring. "The bullet missed the bone, and I can control the bleeding. You're going to be fine, but I need you to stay still while I work." The pressure bandage required careful application, with Elena using her knowledge of anatomy to position it precisely over the damaged artery. The procedure was complicated by the ongoing gunfire, which made it difficult to maintain the steady hands necessary for precise medical work. But Elena had trained for exactly this type of distraction, learning to maintain focus and fine motor control even when explosions were going off around her. As she worked on Park's leg, Elena became aware that the tactical situation was changing. The enemy fire had decreased in intensity, suggesting that the insurgents were either running low on ammunition or preparing to withdraw from the area. Chun was coordinating with his soldiers to maintain defensive positions while preparing for possible casualty evacuation. Elena completed the arterial pressure bandage and checked Park's circulation below the injury site. His pulse was weak but present, indicating that blood flow to his lower leg was being maintained despite the arterial damage. The bleeding had stopped completely, and his color was improving as his body began to compensate for the blood loss. She moved on to the 3 soldiers with minor injuries, conducting rapid assessments and applying basic first aid to their shrapnel wounds and concussion symptoms. These injuries were straightforward, requiring bandages and pain medication, but not the complex trauma procedures that Rodriguez and Park had needed. As Elena worked on the minor casualties, she became aware that the atmosphere in the compound had changed. The soldiers who had been watching her with skeptical interest were now observing her with something that looked more like respect. She'd successfully stabilized 2 critically wounded patients under hostile fire, demonstrating both the medical competence and the physical capability that some had questioned. Williams approached her as she finished treating the last of the minor casualties. "Doc, I've got to admit, I had my doubts about whether you could handle this kind of situation. But watching you work under fire, seeing how you manage those arterial bleeds and complex trauma wounds, I'm impressed. You know your stuff." Elena nodded acknowledgement of the compliment while continuing to monitor her critical patients. Rodriguez remained unconscious but stable, his breathing easier and his pulse stronger than it had been when she'd first begun treatment. Park was alert and responsive, his leg injury controlled and his circulation maintained. "The job's not finished yet," Elena replied. "We still need to get these patients back to the vehicles and evacuated to proper medical facilities. Rodriguez needs surgery within the next few hours, and Park's going to require vascular repair work that I can't do in the field. The evacuation would present the greatest physical challenge of the mission." Rodriguez was unconscious and unable to assist with his own movement, making him a deadweight casualty who would need to be carried across difficult terrain. Park could walk with assistance, but his leg injury would limit his mobility and require someone to provide physical support throughout the journey. Chun coordinated with Thompson to establish a movement plan that would get the casualties back to the vehicles while maintaining security against possible enemy contact. The route would take them through the same difficult terrain they'd used to approach the compound, but now they would be moving with wounded soldiers who couldn't navigate obstacles independently. Elena checked her patients one final time, ensuring that their bandages were secure and their conditions were stable enough for movement. Rodriguez would need constant monitoring during the evacuation, with Elena prepared to provide additional medical treatment if his condition deteriorated during transport. The decision was made to move the casualties in order of priority, with Rodriguez being evacuated first since his injuries were the most critical. Elena would accompany him personally, providing medical care during the journey and ensuring that his condition remained stable throughout the evacuation process. But as they prepared to move Rodriguez, the tactical situation suddenly changed. A burst of automatic weapons fire erupted from a new direction, indicating that additional enemy forces had arrived and were attempting to cut off the evacuation route. Chun's radio crackled with reports from his perimeter guards, painting a picture of increased enemy activity and escalating threat levels. "We've got movement to the south and east," Chun reported. "Looks like they're trying to surround the compound and prevent us from getting the casualties out. We need to move now, before they can establish blocking positions on our evacuation route." Elena understood that the window for safe evacuation was closing rapidly. Every minute of delay increased the risk that they would be trapped in the compound with critically wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical evacuation. But rushing the evacuation could also compromise patient care and potentially cause additional injuries. Thompson made the tactical decision that would determine the success or failure of the entire mission. "We move all casualties simultaneously. Martinez and Williams will provide security. Chun's team will assist with casualty movement. Vasquez, you'll manage medical care for all patients during movement. Everyone else maintains defensive positions until we're clear of the village." Elena felt the weight of that responsibility settle on her shoulders. She would be responsible for maintaining the medical condition of 5 wounded soldiers while moving through difficult terrain under hostile fire. It was exactly the type of challenge that had made some people question whether she had the physical and mental capabilities necessary for combat medicine. But Elena was ready. She'd trained for this moment, prepared herself mentally and physically for exactly this type of situation. Her medical skills were proven, her determination was unwavering, and her understanding of what was required was crystal clear. The evacuation began with Rodriguez, who was loaded onto an improvised stretcher constructed from equipment and materials available in the compound. Elena positioned herself beside the stretcher, one hand maintaining pressure on his most critical wound while the other managed his 4 fluids and medications. The movement through the compound was awkward and challenging, with the stretcher bearers struggling to navigate narrow passages while maintaining the smooth motion necessary to prevent additional injury to their patient. Elena moved with them, her attention divided between monitoring Rodriguez's medical condition and watching for obstacles that could complicate the evacuation. As they exited the compound and began moving across open ground, the enemy fire intensified. Rifle rounds cracked overhead, forcing the evacuation team to move in short rushes between pieces of cover. Elena found herself running in a crouched position, her medical bag bouncing against her side, her hands maintaining contact with Rodriguez, even as they moved at speeds that challenged her ability to provide proper medical care. The first major obstacle was a dried irrigation ditch that required the evacuation team to lower the stretcher carefully while maintaining security against possible enemy contact. Elena climbed down into the ditch first, positioning herself to receive Rodriguez and continue his medical care while the stretcher bearers navigated the descent. The walls of the ditch were steep and unstable, with loose soil that shifted under the weight of the soldiers and their equipment. Elena braced herself against the side wall, using her body as a stabilizing point for the stretcher while Williams and Martinez maneuvered it into position. Rodriguez's condition remained stable throughout the movement, but Elena could see signs that his internal injuries were more serious than her initial assessment had indicated. His pulse was becoming weaker, his breathing more labored, and his color suggested ongoing blood loss that her field treatment had slowed but not stopped completely. She adjusted his 4 fluids and administered additional pain medication, understanding that his comfort during the evacuation was important, but secondary to maintaining his cardiovascular stability. The balance between adequate pain control and maintaining blood pressure was delicate, requiring constant monitoring and frequent adjustments based on his response to treatment. As they climbed out of the irrigation ditch, Elena realized that the physical demands of the evacuation were exceeding what anyone had anticipated. The combination of difficult terrain, hostile fire, and the weight of carrying wounded soldiers was pushing even the strongest soldiers to their limits. Williams was breathing heavily, his face flushed with exertion and stress. Martinez was struggling to maintain her weapon at the ready while simultaneously helping to navigate obstacles. But Elena was managing the challenge better than the larger soldiers around her. Her smaller size required less energy to move through confined spaces, and her medical training had included extensive physical conditioning specifically designed to prepare medics for exactly this type of situation. While the others were beginning to show signs of fatigue, Elena maintained her pace and her focus on providing medical care. The second major obstacle was a rocky outcropping that blocked their direct route to the vehicles. The evacuation team would need to navigate around the formation, adding distance and time to their journey while remaining exposed to enemy observation and possible direct fire. Elena made a quick tactical decision based on her assessment of Rodriguez's condition. "We need to move faster," she told Thompson. "He's deteriorating, and I don't think he can survive much more delay in getting to proper medical facilities." Thompson nodded and increased the pace, pushing the evacuation team to move more quickly despite the increased risk of injury or enemy contact. Elena matched the increased pace, her medical bag secured tightly against her body, her attention focused on maintaining Rodriguez's access and monitoring his vital signs. As they rounded the rocky outcropping, they came under direct fire from enemy positions that had been established along their evacuation route. Rifle rounds struck the rocks around them, sending sharp fragments flying and forcing the team to take cover behind whatever protection they could find. Elena pressed herself against a large boulder, her body shielding Rodriguez from possible enemy fire while she continued to provide medical care. The situation was exactly what she'd trained for, the combination of combat stress and medical responsibility that defined battlefield medicine at its most demanding level. The firefight continued for several minutes, with Chun's soldiers returning fire while the evacuation team waited for an opportunity to continue their movement. Elena used the time to reassess Rodriguez's condition, adjusting his treatment based on changes she observed in his pulse, breathing, and responsiveness. During a lull in the enemy fire, Thompson made the decision to continue the evacuation. The team moved in short rushes, covering the remaining distance to the vehicles while maintaining security and medical care for their wounded patients. Elena ran alongside Rodriguez's stretcher, her hands maintaining contact with his 4 lines and pressure bandages, her mind processing the constant stream of information about his condition that would determine whether her treatment was adequate to keep him alive until they reached proper medical facilities. The vehicles appeared ahead of them, their armored hulls offering the promise of protection and rapid evacuation. But Elena knew that reaching the vehicles was only the beginning of the next phase of medical care. The journey back to FOB Mackenzie would take 45 minutes, during which time she would need to maintain the medical condition of all 5 casualties, while dealing with the movement and vibration of vehicles traveling at high speed across rough terrain. As Rodriguez was loaded into the medical vehicle, Elena realized that the most challenging part of her test was about to begin. She would need to demonstrate not just her ability to provide medical care under fire, but her capability to manage multiple critical patients during a high-speed evacuation across hostile territory. The medical vehicle lurched violently as it hit another pothole, sending equipment sliding across the floor and causing Rodriguez to moan softly despite his unconscious state. Elena braced herself against the vehicle's wall while maintaining pressure on his abdominal wound, her other hand adjusting the 4 drip that was keeping his blood pressure stable enough to sustain life. The convoy was moving at maximum speed across terrain that seemed designed to punish both vehicles and passengers, but Elena knew that every minute saved during the return journey could mean the difference between life and death for her patients. Park sat propped against the opposite wall, his face pale but alert, his wounded leg elevated and secured to prevent further damage during the rough ride. The other 3 casualties were arranged around the vehicle's interior, their minor injuries making them mobile enough to help stabilize the more seriously wounded soldiers during transport. Elena had organized them into an impromptu medical team, giving each soldier specific tasks that would help her manage all 5 patients simultaneously. The radio crackled with traffic as the convoy commander coordinated with FOB Mackenzie, arranging for immediate medical evacuation. Helicopters to transport the critical casualties to the combat support hospital at Bagram Airfield. Elena listened to the communications while monitoring Rodriguez's vital signs, understanding that the timing would be crucial. Rodriguez needed surgical intervention within the next hour, and Park's vascular injuries required specialized treatment that wasn't available at the forward operating base. 20 minutes into the return journey, Rodriguez's condition began to deteriorate rapidly. His blood pressure dropped despite the 4 fluids, his pulse became thready and weak, and his breathing grew increasingly labored. Elena recognized the signs of internal bleeding that was overwhelming her field treatment, indicating that the shrapnel had caused more damage than she'd been able to address with basic trauma procedures. She reached for additional hemostatic agents and pressure bandages, but as she began to adjust his treatment, a massive explosion erupted directly in front of the convoy. The lead vehicle disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris as an improvised explosive device detonated beneath it, sending chunks of metal and burning fuel across the roadway. The medical vehicle's driver swerved violently to avoid the wreckage, throwing Elena against the side wall and causing her to lose contact with Rodriguez's IV line. The convoy came to an immediate halt as soldiers dismounted to assess the damage and establish security around the disabled vehicle. Elena could hear automatic weapons fire erupting from multiple directions as enemy forces launched a coordinated ambush designed to destroy the entire convoy and eliminate the wounded soldiers who had already cost them significant casualties. Thompson's voice came over the radio, calm but urgent. "Medical vehicle. We've got the lead vehicle down with multiple casualties. The route ahead is blocked, and we're taking effective fire from concealed positions. We're going to need to establish a defensive perimeter and call for immediate air support." Elena understood the implications immediately. They were trapped in the middle of hostile territory with 5 wounded soldiers, limited ammunition, and no clear evacuation route. The helicopter medical evacuation that had been arranged for Fob Mackenzie was now impossible, and Rodriguez's condition was continuing to deteriorate with each passing minute. She re-established the 4th access and administered emergency medications to stabilize his blood pressure, but she could see that her field treatment was reaching its limits. Rodriguez needed immediate surgery, and she was running out of options for keeping him alive in the back of an armored vehicle while enemy forces attempted to overrun their position. The situation became even more desperate when reports came in that the disabled lead vehicle contained 3 additional casualties, including the convoy commander who had been critically injured in the IED explosion. Elena was now responsible for 8 wounded soldiers with limited medical supplies and no prospect of immediate evacuation. Thompson appeared at the rear of the medical vehicle, his uniform torn and his face blackened with smoke from the explosion. "Doc, we need you to assess the casualties in the lead vehicle. The medic assigned to that truck was killed in the blast, and we've got soldiers who need immediate attention." Elena looked at Rodriguez, whose condition was tenuous but temporarily stabilized, then at Park and the other casualties who were conscious and alert. The decision was automatic, based on medical triage principles that prioritized the greatest number of lives that could be saved with available resources. "Williams, I need you to monitor Rodriguez's vital signs and maintain pressure on his abdominal wound," she instructed. "If his pulse becomes weaker or his breathing becomes more labored, call for me immediately. Park, you're in charge of the other casualties. Keep them calm and watch for any changes in their condition." Elena gathered her medical supplies and followed Thompson toward the burning wreckage of the lead vehicle. The scene was devastating, with twisted metal and scattered equipment creating obstacles that would challenge even uninjured soldiers. The 3 survivors were trapped in the rear compartment, protected from the worst of the explosion but unable to extract themselves due to their injuries and the vehicle's damaged structure. The first casualty was Sergeant Davis, the convoy commander, who had sustained massive trauma to his lower extremities when the blast wave compressed the vehicle's floor. His legs were crushed beneath twisted metal, and Elena could see immediately that he was bleeding internally from injuries that were beyond the scope of field medicine. But he was conscious and alert, his command presence intact despite his critical condition. "Doc, how bad is it?" Davis asked, his voice steady despite the obvious pain he was experiencing. Elena conducted a rapid assessment, understanding that honesty was more important than false reassurance in this situation. "Your legs are badly damaged, and you've got internal injuries that I can't treat here," she replied while applying pressure bandages to control external bleeding. "But if we can get you to a proper medical facility, the surgeons can fix most of this. You're going to make it, but we need to get you out of here first." The second casualty was Corporal Jackson, who had been thrown against the vehicle's communications equipment when the IED detonated. He was unconscious with obvious head trauma, his breathing irregular and his pupils unresponsive to light. Elena recognized the signs of severe traumatic brain injury that would require immediate neurosurgical intervention to prevent permanent damage or death. The third casualty was Private Martinez, who had sustained burns across his arms and chest when the vehicle's fuel system was damaged in the explosion. His injuries were painful but not immediately life-threatening, requiring burn treatment and pain management, but not the emergency procedures that Davis and Jackson needed. Elena worked rapidly to stabilize all 3 casualties, applying advanced trauma procedures while enemy fire continued to impact around their position. The combination of medical complexity and tactical pressure was overwhelming, but she forced herself to focus on one patient at a time, one procedure at a time, using her training to maintain effectiveness under impossible conditions. As she worked on Jackson's head injury, Elena became aware that the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy forces were closing in on their position, and the remaining vehicles lacked the firepower necessary to break through the ambush and continue toward Phoebe Mackenzie. Thompson was coordinating defensive fires while simultaneously trying to arrange for helicopter extraction, but the enemy's coordinated assault was preventing aircraft from approaching the area. The realization hit Elena like a physical blow. They weren't going to be rescued. The convoy was trapped, the casualties were deteriorating, and the only medical evacuation available was what she could provide with the resources immediately available. 8 wounded soldiers were depending on her to keep them alive until a breakthrough could be achieved, but that breakthrough might not come for hours. Elena made a decision that would define not just her military career, but her understanding of what she was capable of achieving when everything was on the line. She would evacuate the casualties herself, carrying them one by one to a secure position where helicopter extraction might be possible. The plan was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible. Elena would need to carry 8 wounded soldiers, including several who were unconscious dead weight, across difficult terrain while under enemy fire. Her small size and limited physical strength would be tested against challenges that would strain even the largest and strongest soldiers in the unit. But Elena had advantages that weren't immediately obvious to casual observers. Her medical training had included extensive physical conditioning, specifically designed for casualty evacuation under combat conditions. Her smaller size meant she required less energy to move across difficult terrain, and her knowledge of anatomy allowed her to position patients in ways that distributed their weight more efficiently. Most importantly, Elena had something that couldn't be measured in pounds or inches: the absolute determination to succeed regardless of the cost. She'd spent her entire military career preparing for this moment, training for the opportunity to prove that size didn't define capability, that strength came in forms that couldn't be evaluated through physical appearance. Elena began with Rodriguez, whose condition was the most critical and whose survival depended on immediate evacuation to surgical facilities. She positioned herself beside his stretcher, calculating the best way to lift and carry a soldier who weighed nearly twice as much. As she did, the technique she employed was based on firemen's carries and emergency evacuation procedures that she'd practiced countless times during training. But training scenarios couldn't replicate the stress of performing these procedures under enemy fire with a critically wounded patient whose life depended on her physical capability. Elena lifted Rodriguez with smooth, controlled motion, distributing his weight across her shoulders and back in a way that allowed her to maintain balance while moving across uneven terrain. The load was enormous, pushing her physical limits immediately, but her conditioning and determination allowed her to maintain the pace necessary for successful evacuation. The first 100 meters were the most challenging, as Elena navigated around the burning vehicles while carrying Rodriguez toward a rocky outcropping that would provide concealment from enemy observation. Enemy fire cracked around them, forcing Elena to move in a crouched position that made the physical demands even more severe. But Elena maintained her pace, her breathing controlled despite the enormous physical effort required. Rodriguez remained unconscious throughout the movement, his medical condition stable enough that the evacuation wasn't causing additional trauma. Elena's medical training allowed her to monitor his vital signs even while carrying him, ensuring that her evacuation efforts weren't compromising his survival. She reached the rocky outcropping and positioned Rodriguez in a protected area where he would be safe from enemy fire while she returned for the next casualty. The round trip had taken 12 minutes, during which time Elena had carried 180 pounds. of dead weight across 200 meters of difficult terrain under hostile fire. 7 more casualties remained. Elena returned for Jackson, whose head injury required careful handling to prevent additional trauma during movement. The unconscious soldier presented different challenges than Rodriguez, requiring Elena to maintain spinal alignment while carrying him across terrain that would challenge her balance and stability. The second evacuation was completed in 10 minutes, with Elena's conditioning and technique allowing her to move more efficiently as she adapted to the physical demands of the task. Jackson was positioned beside Rodriguez in the protected area, his breathing stabilized and his head injury immobilized to prevent further damage. Park was next, his consciousness allowing him to assist with the evacuation by maintaining some control over his body position during the carry. But his leg injury made him unable to walk independently, requiring Elena to provide full support for his weight while navigating obstacles that could aggravate his vascular trauma. Elena modified her carrying technique for Park's injury, positioning him to protect his wounded leg while maintaining circulation to the extremity. The evacuation required careful attention to medical considerations that were secondary with unconscious patients, but crucial with injuries that could be worsened by improper handling. By the time Elena completed Park's evacuation, word of what she was accomplishing had spread throughout the defensive perimeter. Soldiers who had questioned her physical capabilities were watching her carry casualties that would challenge men twice her size, performing evacuations under fire that demonstrated strength and determination that couldn't be measured by conventional standards. Thompson approached her as she prepared to return for Sergeant Davis. "Doc, this is incredible what you're doing, but you've got to be reaching your physical limits. Maybe we should try to get some of the other soldiers to help with the remaining casualties." Elena shook her head while checking her equipment and preparing for the next evacuation. "The other soldiers need to maintain defensive positions to prevent the enemy from overrunning us. And Davis is trapped in that vehicle wreckage. It's going to take someone small enough to get in there and extract him properly." Davis presented the most complex evacuation challenge, trapped beneath twisted metal with crush injuries that required careful extraction to prevent additional trauma. Elena would need to navigate into the damaged vehicle, stabilize his injuries, and then carry him out through the same confined space that was barely large enough for her to enter. The extraction took 25 minutes, with Elena working in the cramped confines of the destroyed vehicle while enemy fire continued to impact around their position. Davis remained conscious throughout the procedure, providing assistance when possible but primarily depending on Elena's strength and technique to move him safely from the wreckage. Elena emerged from the vehicle carrying Davis, her uniform soaked with sweat and her breathing labored from the enormous physical effort required. But her determination remained unwavering, her focus sharp despite the accumulating fatigue that was beginning to affect her movement and coordination. The evacuation of the remaining casualties continued with mechanical precision, Elena returning again and again to carry soldiers who had been wounded in service to their country and who now depended entirely on her physical capability and medical expertise to survive. Corporal Jackson was unconscious dead weight, requiring spinal precautions. Private Martinez was alert but burned, needing careful handling to prevent additional trauma to his damaged skin. The 3 soldiers with minor injuries from the original patrol were mobile enough to assist with their own evacuation, but they still required Elena's strength and support to navigate the difficult terrain safely. Each evacuation pushed Elena closer to her physical limits, but she maintained her pace through determination that seemed to draw strength from sources beyond normal human endurance. Soldiers throughout the defensive perimeter watched her work, their earlier skepticism replaced by awe and respect for what she was accomplishing under impossible conditions. As Elena completed the final evacuation, carrying the last wounded soldier to the protected area where the others waited for helicopter extraction, the tactical situation began to improve. Air support had arrived overhead, forcing enemy forces to withdraw from their positions around the convoy. The route to FOB Mackenzie was being cleared by additional ground forces that had been dispatched when the ambush was reported. But the improvement in tactical conditions came too late for conventional evacuation. Rodriguez's condition had continued to deteriorate despite Elena's field treatment, and he needed immediate surgical intervention that was only available at facilities beyond FOB Mackenzie. The helicopter medical evacuation that had been impossible during the ambush was now the only option for saving his life. Elena had carried 8 wounded soldiers to safety, moving more than 1,400 pounds of human weight across difficult terrain under enemy fire. Her small stature, which had been seen as a limitation by soldiers who measured capability through physical appearance, had proven to be exactly what was required when conventional evacuation methods were impossible. The helicopter appeared overhead. As Elena completed her final medical assessments of the evacuated casualties, Rodriguez was unconscious but stable, his vital signs improved by the rapid evacuation that had gotten him to safety before his internal injuries could prove fatal. Davis was alert and responsive, his crush injuries controlled and his pain managed through medications that Elena had administered during the evacuation. All 8 casualties were loaded onto the helicopter for immediate transport to the combat support hospital at Bagram Airfield, where surgical teams were standing by to provide the advanced medical care that Elena's field treatment had made possible. As the aircraft lifted off, carrying the wounded soldiers toward the definitive medical care that would save their lives, Elena remained on the ground to assist with the evacuation of equipment and personnel from the ambush site. Thompson approached her as the helicopter disappeared into the distance, his expression carrying the kind of professional respect that passed between soldiers who had witnessed extraordinary performance under combat conditions. "Doc, I've never seen anything like what you just accomplished. 8 casualties evacuated under fire by someone who weighs barely over 100 pounds. That's going to be talked about for years." Elena nodded acknowledgement while continuing to pack her medical equipment, her movements automatic despite the enormous physical and emotional exhaustion that was beginning to affect her coordination. "They're good soldiers who deserve to make it home to their families. I just did what needed to be done." Williams joined the conversation, his earlier skepticism completely replaced by admiration for what he had witnessed. "Doc, I owe you an apology. I questioned whether you had the physical capability to handle combat medicine, but watching you carry those casualties under fire, seeing how you managed 8 wounded soldiers simultaneously, I understand now that strength isn't just about size." The convoy resumed movement toward FOB Mackenzie, traveling roads that had been cleared by the air support and reinforcing ground forces. Elena rode in the medical vehicle, her equipment secured around her, her mind already processing the lessons learned from the mission and the procedures that had proven effective under actual combat conditions. As they approached the base, Elena reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past few hours. She had entered the mission as a medic whose capabilities were questioned by soldiers who measured competence through physical appearance. She was returning as someone who had proven that determination, training, and heart could overcome limitations that seemed insurmountable to casual observation. The base medical facility was prepared to receive any additional casualties from the mission, but Elena's work had ensured that all 8 wounded soldiers had been evacuated directly to advanced medical facilities where they could receive the specialized care their injuries required. Her field treatment and evacuation procedures had bridged the gap between injury and definitive care, providing the margin of survival that would allow them to return to their families. Major Harrison met the convoy at the base entrance, his expression serious as he debriefed the mission commanders on the tactical and medical aspects of the operation. Elena provided her medical report while continuing to monitor communications from the hospital, tracking the progress of her former patients as they underwent the surgical procedures that would determine their long-term prognosis Word of Elena's performance spread throughout Fort Mackenzie with the speed that military bases reserve for truly extraordinary events. The story of the small medic who had single-handedly evacuated 8 wounded soldiers under enemy fire became the kind of legend that defined what was possible when training. Determination and courage converged under impossible circumstances. But Elena wasn't interested in legends or recognition. She was focused on the radio reports from Bagram Airfield, where Rodriguez was undergoing emergency surgery to repair the internal damage that her field treatment had stabilized long enough for evacuation. The reports were encouraging. The surgical team had successfully controlled his internal bleeding and repaired the damage to his vital organs. Davis was in surgery to address his crush injuries, with orthopedic specialists working to save his legs and restore function that would allow him to continue his military career. Jackson was being evaluated by neurosurgeons, who were optimistic about his recovery from the traumatic brain injury that had threatened his life during the evacuation. All 8 soldiers were expected to recover fully, returning to their families and their military careers because Elena had refused to accept that her size defined her capabilities. She had proven that strength came in forms that couldn't be measured by conventional standards, that determination could overcome physical limitations, and that the heart of a warrior wasn't determined by the size of the body that contained it. The mission had tested Elena against challenges that would have defeated soldiers twice her size, and she had succeeded through a combination of medical expertise, physical conditioning, and the kind of determination that couldn't be taught in any training program. She had carried the weight of 8 lives across hostile terrain, proving that heroism wasn't about physical appearance, but about the willingness to act when action was required. As the base settled into its evening routine, Elena completed her equipment maintenance and prepared her medical supplies for the next mission. She understood that respect in a combat zone was earned through performance under fire, and she had earned the respect of every soldier on FOB Mackenzie through her actions during the most challenging day of her military career. The doubts and skepticism that had followed her throughout her deployment were now replaced by confidence and trust from soldiers who had witnessed what she was capable of achieving when their lives depended on her skills and determination. Elena had proven that heroes came in all sizes, that strength was measured by actions rather than appearance, and that the smallest soldiers could carry the heaviest burdens when their fellow warriors needed them most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, and new opportunities to serve the soldiers who depended on military medicine to bring them home alive. But tonight, Elena could rest knowing that 8 families would not receive devastating phone calls. 8 soldiers would recover from their injuries, and 8 men who had questioned her capabilities now understood that size was just a number when measured against the content of a warrior's heart. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.